What unfolded within the walls of these breeding farms is a grotesque testament to the depths to which humanity can descend. The tales that emerge from these twisted institutions defy reason, challenging our very understanding of compassion and empathy. What were the societal and economic factors that enabled the establishment and operation of these insane breeding farms? How did the insane reality of slave breeding farms impact the physical, mental, and emotional well-being of the enslaved individuals? Let's venture into a realm of horror where the concept of human dignity is torn asunder. In the 1820s, the growing demand for cotton drove a lot of farmers and people who wanted to be planters to move to areas that hadn't been settled yet. These places, like Mississippi and Louisiana, had rich soil that was perfect for growing cotton, which was a valuable cash crop. As the so-called Cotton Kingdom grew, it needed more workers to keep up with the growing needs of the business. In 1808, the United States Congress banned the foreign slave trade. This meant that slaves from Africa and the West Indies could no longer be brought to the United States. This ruling was a turning point in American history because it stopped new slaves from coming from outside the country. When the trade stopped, slave owners could no longer get slaves from other countries to work for them. Since the international slave trade was stopped, slave owners have found a new way to get more slaves to work for them: breeding. The only realistic way to get more people to work for them was to have more slaves. The ability of black women to have children became important in both politics and business. Slave moms were expected to have enough children to replace workers who got old or died. The need to keep the slave society in the South going made it important to have more babies. Slave owners and breeders used selective breeding to make slaves with features that they wanted. They kept their own big male slaves, called bucks, and also brought in more male slaves to make sure they had strong workers for the farms. This was done on purpose to improve the standard and output of the slaves who would come after them. Slave breeders were very interested in how fertile slave women were. They expected and urged people to have more than one child, so there would be more slaves to work. People thought that black women's ability to have children was important for keeping and growing the slave workforce. If the captive women didn't have enough children, their worth could go down. Before doctors got involved, slave women who were having a hard time giving birth were often left to their own ways. But slave breeders knew how important it was for births to go well, and how important it was to keep both moms and babies alive. Because of this, home medical magazines were made to give advice and help during difficult births. The goal of these diaries was to improve the results of hard births, which were previously only handled by slaves. What awaited the innocent souls born into the confines of this dehumanizing system? As their tiny cries pierced the air, what sinister fate befell these slave infants, forever bound by the chains of their lineage? Once the slaves were born, they were taken to different places where they were sold and given to different people. There were various ways to do this, such as boats that frequently stopped in New Orleans, which was the largest slave market in the South before the Civil War. A lot of the time, ships from Richmond and Baltimore were left out of historical accounts. Slaves were also moved on trains, in boxcars, and by stagecoach. The movement of slaves was a big reason why the slave trade grew and why breeding farms and ranches could make money. Slaves were considered property, and people or groups could own them. As property, they could be mortgaged to banks, just like other things that can be seen and touched. Slave owners used the people they owned as collateral to get loans and pay for different projects. This allowed slaveholders to use the economic value of their slaves and treat them as goods that could be traded. A bond scheme was set up to get more money out of the economic value of slaves. Especially in the South, slave owners set up new banks and made lists of slaves to use as security. These banks made bonds, which were then promoted and sold to buyers all over the world, including in big financial cities like London, New York, Amsterdam, and Paris. Even though they lived in countries where slavery was illegal, the investors owned bonds backed by the value of the slaves. The interest and capital on these bonds or paid with the money made from slave work and slave markets,